All right, everyone, might as well get started on time here. Welcome to the cDc panel. Time for me to go away.
Is anybody out there who was here 20 years ago at DEF CON 7? Might have seen these guys. Show of hands.
Raise your hand.
Pretty good.
Well, I saw it.
I saw them. They were awesome.
Yeah, they were great.
All right.
Listen to those dudes.
This is like the 727, like DEF CON 7, DEF CON 27.
As long as they're not the 737 MAX, I think we'll be okay.
Thanks for showing up. I'm really excited about this. This is the largest cDc assemblage on a panel in close to 20 years.
I miss you guys.
Just briefly introducing folks here. I mean, you can read the bios and stuff. I'm Joe Menn. I'm a reporter, and I wrote a book about these guys, which I hope you read. This is Deth Veggie. Luke Benfei is his actual name.
Oh, God.
Minister of Propaganda for the Cult of the Dead Cow, and he's got like a regular security job, too. Next is Omega. The elusive. He says this is his first HackerCon in close to 20 years. So show him some love, please.
Woo! Thank you.
So if you read cDc text files once upon a time, or more recently, the odds are pretty good that Misha edited them, and he also invented the word hacktivism, which continues to resonate today.
And if you're a fan of the $6 million man.
Oh, yeah.
It's a good file.
And the clean cut looking gentleman is some dude named Mudge. Living legend, former DARPA cybersecurity czar, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Frequent keynote speaker here and just all-around inspiration. Inventor of the cyber fast track at DARPA, which gave like government money to people like you to go find cool shit. And then finally, Chris Rue, Dildog, the man who wrote BO2K, released here 20 years ago. More recently birthed some unicorn called Veracode, which is a fabulous company. So if they were most famous 20 years ago, why would I write a book about them now? Why would we all be gathered here today? It's a good question. There are actually three reasons. One is they're still around today, and they go back to the mid-'80s. So they're a skeleton key for like all of the major turns in InfoSec and hacking through that time. You don't have to go back and read 30 years worth of Usenet posts. You can if you want to, but you don't have to get the the essence of the major leaps forward in InfoSec. That's one reason. The second reason is my last book was depressing as hell. It was called Fatal System Error, and it was about basically how we're all screwed because security is hopeless and the Russians hate us and they don't care about crime and all this other stuff. All of which is still true. I don't want to give you the idea that we're not screwed.
No, the Kremlin dislikes us. The Russians are fine people.
Russians are nice folks. But it was a downer. If I only got to write one book on cybersecurity, I would probably write a downer. I would say we're basically screwed. But I get to write two. It turns out I lived long enough to write another one. And I wanted to do something positive, so here's something that works. Here's something that's worth emulating and worth trying. And the third reason is that cDC has, I think, at least three key qualities that are really, really important that I want to get out there into the world, particularly to folks that weren't around back in the day. The most important is critical thinking. I feel like have a worldwide crisis in the lack of critical thinking. We have people who believe that the world is flat. And I don't think we're going to get the Department of Education to parachute philosophy professors into school districts around the country to teach them critical tthinking. So we have to find some other way of celebrating and holding this quality up. And all good hackers are by definition critical thinkers. Because you're looking at a system and you're trying to make it do something it wasn't designed to do, to see if that works. And we need that in all walks of life more than ever right now. The second is they had one or more moral causes driving them. It varied over the years. It varied based on the individual. Pursuit of knowledge, spreading of knowledge, human rights. There were many moral causes, and I think that's really fundamental and is also getting lost today. And the third thing is that they're adaptable. The CDC morphed so many times. It started, bulletin board operators, text files that were funny, sometimes obscene, some written by presidential candidates,
Then spoken word.
and then there was like the sort of tech influx, and they managed to slap Microsoft around until they got this court-certified monopoly to take security more seriously. And then they did amazing things since then in the public sector, Mudge and others, private sector, Dildog and others, and keeping the idea of hacktivism alive in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, and sort of garden variety activism. And they've done all those amazing things. So I think as stuff gets weirder and harder in this world, the ability to adapt, the ability to say, well, I know this thing, I'm going to keep these values, and I'm going to try this totally new terrain, learn how to mess with the media, learn how to talk to Congress. I think that's essential now, as we're doing with info ops and all this other stuff that none of us have a background in. I think it's really important to be able to do that. So, without further ado, I want to sort of go through the chronology here reasonably quickly. It's like to have Q&A at the end, and I want to have everybody talk about, the way forward when we're done. So, we'll start off with Luke here. Veggie, give us a little bit of the history. Lubbock, where did CDC come from, and when did you run into it?
Well, Cult of the Dead Cow came out of Lubbock, Texas in the mid-'80s. It was founded by... Woohoo!
More into the mic.
More into the mic? Came out of Lubbock, Texas in the mid-'80s. It was founded by 3 punk kids, Swamp Rat, Frankenjibe, and the elusive Sid Vicious.
Yeah.
Sid Vicious was only temporarily involved with it, and then his parents took his modem away. The other guys started to spread around bulletin boards within Texas, and then further out, publishing text files, sort of developing a network of other BBSs that would sort of publish and release CDC files, because they framed it as you get to release CDC files. We'll put you in, you'll be a member of the K-Cow Force, and being a member of the K-Cow Force means you're allowed to release CDC files. And people are like, oh yeah, I want to be allowed to release CDC files. Yeah, exactly. So, as I say, started in Texas, but by the late '80s had spread much further. I grew up outside of Boston. I'd been exposed to CDC through their text files as far back as '87. So they were, they're a group I was aware of and looked up to. I started to talk to various members on BBSs. Then I started to allegedly set up hypothetically illegal phone systems to talk to them, and so that they could talk to each other, and eventually I was invited to join. That was in '91, I believe.
Yeah, these are my people.
Yeah. And so, after that, so I would say that I think it's probably to say that I was part of the sort of the second generation of CDC after the really early members, including Obscure Images, who's here today, had sort of really blazed the trail. From the very beginning, I looked up to CDC, and I'm still immensely proud to be a part of it.
Awesome.
So I just want to say that among the first generation also is this Beto O'Rourke guy. You might have heard of
Psychedelic
him.
Warlord.
Yeah.
Psychedelic Warlord 2020, make America K-Rat again.
And Kevin Wheeler, I don't know if you Swamp Rat,
yeah.
Yeah, the
Sorry,
main,
Grandmaster Rat.
Grandmaster
he was
Rat.
promoted.
So that's the beginnings in Texas. Another very key early member is Jesse Dryden.
Mr. Drunk Fucks.
Yeah, we're at DEF CON. We can say his handle. It's Drunk Fucks. So he started HoHoCon, which was the first hacking convention to bring in, to invite the press and the cops, so they didn't have to go to the trouble of pretending to be hackers and secretly like trying to recruit snitches and bust people. Misha, you went to early Ho-Ho Cons. So did Jeff Moss, some guy. He got some ideas from there, I've heard. Take us back to early Ho-Ho Cons. What was the significance of getting together in person with all these people you only knew on BBSs?
Sure. So the first hacker conventions were like SummerCon, and they were invite only. So if you happened to be users on privileged BBSs that participated in SummerCon, you would find out about the invite. It would be in St. Louis during some summer months when school was out, and
possibly at the same time as a swinger convention.
That's a different story. Yes, there's a swinger convention angle to this as well. Anyway, so the original.
Several of us were really confused when we showed up at some of these early conventions going, is this what hacking is?
And hijinks ensued.
So the original hacking conventions were invite only, right? So these were private affairs. Hackers were going to talk amongst themselves, and of course they wouldn't want journalists or certainly law enforcement there to record everything that was going on, even though they probably were there from the very beginning. When Drunk Fucks started HoHoCon, his first attempt at HoHoCon was also invite only, but then somebody found out about it, and they let the Howard Johnsons know that there was going to be a bunch of hackers descending over Christmas time at their hotel, and Howard Johnson's had a fit about this, and they canceled the contract. And so, and it became public that there was going to be a bunch of hackers somewhere in Houston over the summer, the Christmas vacation. And Drunk Fucks famously sent out this message to on BBS, cDc BBS is saying, Hojo's says no to ho-ho. And so kind of out of that, he said, screw it. We're going to have another convention somewhere else. We'll find some other hotel to go to. And this time, we'll just invite law enforcement. And we'll invite the FBI. And we'll invite journalists. Maybe they'll show up, maybe they won't. So this was one of the first hacker conventions that was sort of open to the public. And many of the things that people take for granted as features of DEF CON and Black Hat were actually pioneered at HoHoCon. So spot the Fed. Why would you spot the Fed? Because we're inviting them to this convention and they're trying to fit in. Mm-hmm. They're the ones with the crew cuts and they're burly looking and they look uncomfortable being there, and it's easy to spot them, right? So HoHoCon invented the Spot the Fed contest. They invented selling hacker T-shirts in order to recoup costs for the convention. That was a big, so swag.
Merchandising
was a big thing. Capture the flag was something else also pioneered at HoHoCon. And so this HoHoCon was this kind of critical in computer security history for pioneering all these things sort of incidentally. That have become staples of security conventions generally, or Black Hat and DEF CON specifically now.
So I also, a couple other quick things on that. One is that Texas is kind of big, and in Boston or New York, hackers could get together more easily. So you sort of you needed like an organized event to get people there. And I think the personal relationships that developed that you can only do in person instead of just online made a big difference in sort of the cDC's trajectory.
Yeah.
I mean, you could actually trust each other.
You're right.
Which has not been true of many other hackers.
And that was one of the effects of SummerCon, in that you got to meet Taryn King, Nightlining, all these hackers that you looked up to who were on BBSs that you called. But again, it was invite only. It was a very, very small, select, elite, if you will, group. The number of people who attended SummerCon was like less than 50, maybe 50 people. And that at HoHoCon, it was, again, open to the public. It started out with, maybe more than 50 people and then grew and grew and grew. But for cDC, it was the first time that most of us could meet each other, right? So I was living in Boston. I knew the Boston crew. I knew that the folks who would later, the Boston people who would later join, be inducted into cDC. the people who would later form the Loft. But that's all I knew. I didn't know the CDC people in Texas. I didn't know them in Wisconsin, Chicago. I didn't know them anywhere else. And so when Drunk Fucks put on HoHoCon, this was an opportunity not just to meet other hackers that I looked up to, but it was an opportunity to meet other hackers in CDC, other people in CDC that I had looked up to or that I had communicated with but had never ever met. So that was important to us as well.
I could say, for me, it was, again, as you say, it was like you're meeting your friends for the first time. You're meeting the face behind the monitor. And especially back then, that was a really big deal.
So another thing that makes CDC different from other groups of the time, and CDC wasn't the first, it's just, it's the survivor of them all. Some of the others were more, most of them in the beginning were more technical, right? People who were actually breaking into stuff a lot and writing about it on bulletin boards, perhaps unwisely. Whereas CDC, it sort of came out, it's like the liberal arts wing of the hacker underground, started with the text files. And not everybody was an engineer or a future engineer. Some people were more about the, social issues or the writing itself. And I think that actually allowed CDC to survive when others would get rounded up from time to time. So Mudge, tell us a little bit about the Loft. And before you go there, for those of you who don't know, there's substantial overlap between the Loft, which I assume you all know about, and CDC. 4 members, lifetime, that were in both, including the 2 gents at the end there. Loft pioneering hackerspace, told Congress what was what in 1998. Thank you for that. But the Loft and CDC had an interesting dynamic, which we'll get to in a little bit. So educate folks on a little bit about the Loft and how you came into it.
Sure. So CDC, when they asked me to join, I was already in the Loft, I believe at the time. And what was interesting is they were making this transition from being a bit more of this sort of, I mean, we've always been like the crown jesters, but exactly. They wanted a bit more of a technical sort of presence as they saw the field moving and this sort of handoff to it. And they said, well, do you have any, like advisories or security, write-ups that you could, contribute to us that would, move us in this particular direction? At the time, it was one on S-Key that I did, and I was like, of course. I mean, I was huge fans, and Omega and White Knight were kind of the folks that I was hanging out with, and I really looked up to, and when they were willing to bring me in, it just, it meant the world to me. But what I saw with the Loft, because what we were doing with the Loft, and when Dill came in with the Loft, is we really started going heavily into full disclosure, and we're credited with kind of pioneering a lot of like what it became, the controversy, some of the animosity to it as well. But it was all about we're going to bring transparency to some of these security problems because big corporations, I was working at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, this little company called BBN, which had created TCP/IP and the internet for DARPA many, many years ago. And I was like, I get to work here. This is fantastic. And they were starting to move over to Windows. And we saw a bunch of vulnerabilities there. And we went back to Microsoft. So this was, the Department of Defense and government contractors. And Microsoft was at that point where they were becoming so large that the U.S. government and other governments really couldn't influence them. There was a bigger sort of market for them to play to. And so they said, we don't care. They literally, that was kind of the response. It's not a security problem unless, it's affecting our bottom line. And I went to Tad Elmer, who was the CEO at the time. Actually, it might have been George Conrades. I get him flipped around. And I said, hey, I'm with the Loft. I'm with this hacker group. And they're like, we have no clue what you're talking about, whatever. I'm like, I think I can get them to respond if I do some things, but it's not associated with this company. So we started pushing, vulnerability disclosure and advisories. And so we started giving proof and exploit code and proof of concept because Microsoft could no longer say, it's not a problem, that's just theoretical, because now everybody could do it. And they started to move in response.
That was actually one of the Loft slogans was making the theoretical practical since 1992. So that's where that really came from.
Yep.
So.
And the really fascinating part with CDC, because CDC had this sort of like bad cop, And the way I was trying to help prop the loft up for like I don't want to call it brand recognition, but like where we came across was, this sort of like neutral cop sort of setup. And we were doing the same thing. And here I got to play both sides and say, if we release an advisory through Cult of the Dead Cow, and if we release the same sort of information through the loft, it's the same message, just packaged differently, coming from a different source, and it got a very different reception.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating. So BO, which you're going to hear about, Back Orifice and Back Orifice 2K, came across one way, and we played to see if something's released and it has a negative spin, can you ever claw it back? And if something releases with a somewhat neutral or positive spin, does it become perturbed? So it became this great sort of like culture jamming, like petri dish to really mess around with. And so, I was in love.
So I just think one of the really incredible things going back and looking at this whole history is that, at the time, hackers were still, they were sort of coming into their own in the late 90s. They, were really starting to get attention. People were concerned. People were interested. They were vaguely threatening. They were a little scary. And despite like the pedigree of the people at the loft, the way to actually make change was to be like cartoonishly villainous. Mm-hmm. So Grandmaster Rat here on the stage pacing up and down, rapping with gold chains and rabbit fur chaps and throwing CDs into the crowd.
Literally igniting his crotch on fire with flash powder.
It happened more than once, I think.
Not recommended.
No.
But that generated media. That got the cameras. and Microsoft, when somebody from NBC or ABC or whatever sticks a microphone in Microsoft's face and is like, well, what are you going to do about these evil hackers that are going to allow anybody to hack anything? They actually have to come up with an answer. So Back Orifice came first by Sir Distic here in 98, thank you. So that was the widely distributed Trojan. After that, Microsoft could have said, yeah, you're right, we really need to build in some security with TCP IP. But instead, they said, you know what, it's not a problem at all, but if you're really concerned, then you can upgrade to Windows NT or Windows 2000.
Yeah, 2000.
So they used it as an opportunity to upsell. So at that point, I probably would have given up. But instead, cDc brings Dildog here into the picture and has him write BO2K. So what were you trying? Why didn't you give up? And how was BO2K like more of a poke at Microsoft than BO?
BO2.
And were you independently wealthy? How could you do this?
He's begging my answer here. I got involved with Loft through just random social connections. So like 1994 is when I went to MIT and started to kind of get the sense that there was some hacker culture there, and got very interested in the whole field of security. I met the Loft folks in '96 when I went to DEF CON 4, which is now 23 years ago. And we decided that we needed to talk some more after they had seen some of the stuff I was doing. So we ended up, I ended up becoming the first employee of the Loft, actually, in, I believe, '97. Working on Loft Crack and things like that, we're bringing in some revenue into the Loft so that I didn't have to do my day job, which at the time was just working at a bank. I told my mom, I'm going to quit my day job at the bank that I worked 4 years at MIT to do, and I'm going to go work with a bunch of hairy hackers in a warehouse and make no money until we sell a bunch of copies of a password cracker. And she was like, you better know what you're doing. I'm like, oh yeah. This is great.
And then he saw my code, and he's like, I have no clue what I got into.
Oh my God, I gotta fix this shit. Anyway, so we got Loft Crack out there, and I was searching for other things to do. Saw Back Orifice, was very inspired. I was just like, wow, the notion of remote control and remote administration of Windows systems was kind of near and dear to my heart. Back in '96, hacking Windows was considered extremely lame. Nobody was hacking Windows because systems were not like, nobody was using Windows NT for anything important. It was all like the Solaris and the Ultrix and all this other, big name Unix brands that were cool to hack, and Windows was not cool to hack. So I naturally gravitated toward this because I saw it becoming a big deal, and published a lot of buffer overflow exploits and things like that, and got really deep into system programming and kernel programming. And when I realized how expressive and verbose and ridiculously broad the Linux, so I've been doing that too lately, the Windows kernel was, I realized that you could do so much as a regular user, like so much that you could get away with, opening up threads inside other processes that you didn't start, and then injecting code into them, and then running extra threads in those process spaces. I mean, there's just the amount of stuff you could get away with was so big that I wouldn't call it attack surface, but your ability to create extremely creative programs that did things that nobody expected was completely supported by the OS, and it wasn't. There were no exploits required.
It's like, that's why I'm here.
Yeah, there were no exploits required to write Backwardfs 2000. It was just the design of the thing was so security unaware that you could get away with doing amazingly unprotected things and surreptitious things completely within the bounds of the security designs of Windows. So
Yeah, I mean, it actually gave the person remotely more control over the computer than you had sitting at it.
It was faster to use BO2K to do administration than it was to do it using your own mouse, and keyboard.
In fact, you even released a professional pack
The
later.
Loft had its own commercial BO2K plugin set that no one bought.
Well, it was also free, I think. But they still didn't buy it.
That's true. Maybe we did give it away. But it was like a remote file browser and a registry editor and things like that.
We wanted to have parity with Remotely Possible and all the other PC Anywheres.
Yeah,
like that. Yeah, this is a legitimate tool, which again kind of goes back to
I do know at least a few people that used it legitimately. It's.
I was the person who was getting the email, and I got emails all the time from people like, "Hey, I'm in the Navy, and we use this to administer all the machines in our lab." And
So speaking of which, for folks who aren't aware, just a little context with what Dill actually did with BO2K, and actually cDc kind of pioneered with it, was every one of the major implants that you see today, the core functionality can literally be traced back to this. And I've actually got the history on both sides to say it can be traced back to this.
Yeah. So it was fun. Thanks. BO2K was a big deal. I had a lot of fun writing it. My challenges were making it nice and small and compact. I wrote it without libc. And comparable tools were, megabytes and tens of megabytes of size. It was like 160K or something total when compiled. So,
really tiny.
Just some of the technical challenges there. I had a real fun time with the Windows kernel, and it was. I don't know. Am I even answering the question you asked, Joe? I just love it.
Let me add, just as a side note, we actually thought about selling BO2K for $1. So as a remote administration tool, it competed with Symantec, PC Anywhere, and some other stuff. If you were running an antivirus app, it did not detect PC Anywhere,
Even though it did exactly the same thing.
or any of these other commercial utilities, even though you could trick somebody into installing that and using it just like BO2K. It did not, antivirus vendors did not detect those commercial programs because it would be restraint of trade, right? They're making money off of it, and you're basically depriving them of money. And so for a short time, we thought about we could get antivirus vendors to not detect BO2K if we sold it for $1. And so
Why we didn't sell it?
you can talk about that.
No, why don't you talk?
You go ahead.
Go ahead.
So to set the stage, at the time, crypto was a munition as far as the U.S. government was concerned. Right. And one difference between BO and BO2K is that we wanted strong encryption. We wanted meaningful encryption, because I guess was it just XOR in the original Backwardfs, whereas
twice.
It was ROT26. And what was it? What did you use in BO2K?
And BO2K had a pluggable architecture, so you could plug in different crypto
Yeah,
systems.
but by
it came with triple DES by default.
triple DES,
and there people wrote, Blowfish and AES reigned all before it was AES.
So, but part of this is because encryption, crypto was considered a munition, we're like, well, people are going to be downloading this from all over the world, we assume. Well, how do we handle that? So we actually hired a lawyer. It was a, are we allowed to say?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, we're allowed to say.
Cindy Cohn, who's now with the EFF. So we retained a lawyer and said, hey, we want to do this. How much jail are we going to go to? And
That was a really frequent thing on the mailing list.
yes, it was. Yeah, it really was. And so, basically she said, don't sell it. That's a totally different kettle of fish. And you have to at least make a different version without the triple DES available, and you can say, hey, if you're outside the United States, download this one instead,
Right.
kind of thing.
To give an example, sorry, if I could.
So sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say off the one part of it was a really common sort of like how many years of jail are we going to serve for this? The back and forth between Loft and cDC for the exact same sort of thing. With the crypto as a munition sort of thing, we even set up during this time period, we were like, hey, wait a second. In the Loft, we actually went and started to get our license to manufacture firearms and high capacity and everything else because we found a loophole in the crypto law that says once you are a manufacturer
Of munitions.
of munitions and you have a
any
license for
munition.
munitions, you can do crypto. And anybody could go get a storefront on the Charles River or anything else, sell a prototype into some military or government agency of like, it's got like a little less flashbang or something on it or whatever, and you got this license, and then all of a sudden you could do crypto back and forth. So we were trying to show that it was this sort of like, loophole, and it really was a false flag, and it was really this red herring sort of setup. And that was the beautiful part about the Loft and the cDC, is that we could see this thing on each side and go, hey, wait, we figured this out here. Okay, well, yeah, but they view us as X. Well, let's try it as Y. Oh, look, they view us as Y. Okay, well, bounce it back over to X.
All right. So I want to do some at stake now. So the industry is rapidly evolving. Microsoft brings and AOL bring the internet to everybody, and CDC and the Loft suggest that maybe they ought to put in some security as well. So they get around to that a little bit. But it's 99, 2000. People are making all kinds of money, and why not try to go pro? So. Thus, Loft takes some venture money and becomes at stake, which lasts about 5 years. So some really amazing things happened at stake. Some things didn't work out so well. Why don't you guys talk a little bit about the at stake experience?
I'll lead it off, I guess.
go ahead. Yeah.
I'm the one who got us into that morass.
Mess.
I say that there was some really awesome stuff that came out.
no,
You
it
can
was-
trace you can trace a lot of really influential people, influential organizations, Alex Stamos, Dave Goldsmith, Montesano. There was a lot of good that came out of it. There was a lot of
Katie
personal.
Masouras and Window Snyder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. Veracode, yeah.
Yep.
A lot of technologies and people started amazing things after at stake. So.
Now, for the Loft, it was kind of like a defining moment after we had gone from a hobby group into something with a direction and a mission into something that ultimately, was a lot of friction in other areas. And what we had wanted to do was we wanted to turn, we loved our hobbies, and we all had day jobs for it. And a couple of the things that I had written and that, Weld contributed to or whatever made enough money that we were able to bring in our first, paid employee for it. And we're like, well, wait a second, how can we kind of go pro such that we can do what we love rather than what we're doing during our day jobs, because we don't necessarily all love our day jobs. What we didn't understand at the time was kind of like how the VCs, seemed to align with us, but maybe didn't entirely. But it sounded good, and some hard knocks came, but it turned out to be a really interesting, complex system. And anytime there's a complex system, there's a lot to be learned there.
Yeah.
And the divestiture and the different branches that spread out from it, like Veracode, that came from the Loft all the way through at stake, incubated at stake, and a lot of other ones were very positive.
Let's hear about Veracode.
Veracode's early beginnings were a decompiler effort that I had started in 1999 at the Loft. I had been doing a lot of reverse engineering by hand, found that much of what I was doing was very repetitive, and I wanted to build a tool that would help me do it faster. So I found a very early decompiler research paper by Christina Cifuentes from the Queensland University of Technology, read through that. It's the same research paper that resulted in things like Hexrays and Ghidra and things like that. So I was one of the first to really go through this paper and find ways to enhance what had been done there to produce high-level models of low-level binaries. And we got funding through AtStake to continue to do that research while I was there. AtStake had a very vibrant research team, which was the Loft, plus some other folks that we hired along the way. And the safe decompiler, which used to be called the UDS, which was the Undeveloper Studio.
Also named after a contraceptive device.
No, it
yes.
isn't. No. We.
It was the Loft. There was
the
some
Loft.
humor.
We had a lot of bad jokes in there. So I ended up sort of shepherding that IP through AtStake, getting some employees, building a product, and eventually, when it got sold to Symantec, we basically had no way of keeping that project alive unless we found a way to spin it out. Symantec wasn't going to do anything with the decompiler. We talked to some of their executives, and they were like, it's a C++ thing. We don't do C++ anymore. And we were like, huh? Well, apparently Symantec had a C++ compiler that they had been selling for a while. It was actually
To compete with Borland.
to compete with Borland. It was Symantec C++. So when they stopped doing that, they just kind of looked at what we were building on paper and said, no, we don't do C++ anymore. And they basically let Veracode walk right out the door. So we got some venture capital, proceeded to get it funded and built a company, the first to do binary analysis of things that were not necessarily on your desktop, but sent to you across the internet. People wouldn't send source code for analysis across the internet because it was generally considered to be too valuable to let out the door, but they'd be willing to ship your binaries because they're going to ship those anyway. So there was a business model there. You could do a service. So
We have like 10 minutes, so
yeah, sure. Yeah, I can just keep.
we haven't got to
talking about the
hacktivism. Okay, so Misha, Omega, talk to us about. So we got awesome stuff in the private sector. You can take my word for it if you don't know that Mudge did amazing stuff in the government sector. Tell us a little bit about Oxblood Ruffin's entry into the group and the sort of like the birth of hacktivism and how it's evolved since.
Okay. I'm going to have to share some of the story with Luke, I think.
I can say that the way that Oxblood introduced himself to us is by sending me an email insulting Count Zero. And that was enough to be, he was like, I love all you guys except that fucker of Count Zero. I was like, what? What did Count Zero do to you?
So he came at us in this, again, like Luke said, in this kind of strange way, and I developed a conversation with a couple of cDc members, and we ended up meeting him at DEF CON one year. And he basically came at us almost on day one with a pitch. You guys are pranksters and jesters, and you have the stage a little bit. Have you thought about doing anything more substantial with the media that you can get, or with the attention you can get? Have you ever thought about doing anything more with that? And I think my response was, why can't we have both? ¿Por qué no los dos? And so anyway, we ended up inducting Oxblood into cDC eventually, and he brought a different. He definitely brought a different perspective.
Different sensibility.
A different sensibility. He had a background working at the United Nations. He clearly had a marketing background to him. He had a marketing head to him. He kind of pushed us in certain directions for branding or messaging. And he kind of brought sort of a social consciousness, yeah, to cDC. And this is around the time when the Great Firewall of China started happening, and China was starting to expand out into the rest of the world. And for various personal reasons, he had an interest in China. And we kind of, for various current event reasons, and also because this is sort of his pet peeve, we kind of focused on China as just a focus of attention. And China became kind of a reason for trying out different ideas, and hacktivism became one of them.
All right. So I just to make sure that we hit a couple things before questions. Oh, and I forgot to say earlier, we're all going to sign books at 4:15 in the vendor area in Bally's.
Before you break off, I mean, you can't go from China without talking about Slobodan Milosevic and the CDC being in the Hague.
I just wanted to hit a couple things. Yeah. So one of the great things that they did is they had a hacktivism panel here at DEF CON a couple years later, and Patrick Ball was like actual practitioner, technologist in the field, working on human rights, compiling databases, making sure they're compatible. And so he cross-referenced, the Army officers, where they were with when the most human rights abuses happened, and come up with the worst abusers, and then try and get them fired. He went after Slobodan Milosevic, and who served as his own defense attorney at The Hague, and there is a great exchange where Slobodan Milosevic asks of Patrick Ball, what is your affiliation with this dead cow cult?
You can find
Luke?
Yeah. You can find the video on the Hague website.
Yeah,
when we saw that, it was just like, that's crazy, and I'm not sure I like the fact that this, genocidal dictator knows who we are.
Yeah. It's the International Criminal Court of former Yugoslavia. If you search the transcripts for Cult of the Dead Cow, you'll come up with many, many hits where we're referenced.
Yeah,
It's
Ratko
fascinating.
Mladic, it
Yeah.
came up more than once.
So
You've arrived as a hacktivist organization when you're name checked in a war crimes tribunal, not once, but 3 times. 3 times.
That was well.
So among the influences and impact of the group in this tranche of it was Tor. So Oxblood and friends tried to do a privacy protecting browser, which in turn convinced Dingledine to put a browser into Tor, which seemed like a pretty good idea in retrospect.
Navy had something to do with that earlier also.
No, I mean Navy first, and then it spun off, and then they're like, hey, that's a good idea. We should adopt that.
Yeah.
And they had a significant influence in the early days of the Citizen Lab. Were awesome people at the University of Toronto who track governments using malware against their own citizens. So that lives on. So I think we ought to go to questions, or we're not going to get to any. So I forget how this works. We have mics. Does anybody know?
If you don't have mics, just scream, and whoever's
I was thinking just,
stand up and shout.
write your questions on $20 bills and just bring them up.
Some things never change.
Yeah.
So I will restate it because this needs amplification, which is you're looking at a panel of really white guys from a middle class sort of situation, and where the hell is the diversity? And there was diversity there, so why isn't the diversity here now? Did I catch that correctly?
Lady Caroline didn't want to come, but I will be seeing her this weekend.
But this is really, really important, and this. Thank you, because it's one of the things that we actually really cherished, and it's one of the things that Beto O'Rourke really brought in, because he was one of the earliest
CDC.
people, and I'm not, I'm not trying to push for this. He was an early CDC member, but he was the one that even back then wanted diversity and wanted to bring in like different sorts of opinions, and it was something that we really cherished at the Loft, and the Loft was very white as well, and all male as well. We had Mega Hacker, and we actually had Ada and everybody else.
More.
But it's one of these things where we loved challenging each other. We liked the fact that people came up from different backgrounds, from different understandings, with different experiences and stuff, and we were all frustrated that our experiences weren't different enough. And if you are running a security group, or if you are working with different people, and you look around and everybody looks like you, you're not good defenders, and you're not good hackers, because where you get the different ideas and the different perspectives and how to challenge what you're looking at is from diversity. The more diverse the team you have is, the better you are at finding the vulnerabilities, seeing things differently. So either you become the old guard and you say, no, nobody else joins, or you become the old guard and you say, I welcome the diversity, let's move forward. Thank you.
One more question. Yikes.
So the comment was we didn't talk about the testimony to Congress and what that meant. And real briefly, I mean, that was, CDC actually helped prop that up. There was a lot, I mean, we wouldn't have had the publicity and the recognition for the loft to do it otherwise. There was a lot of behind the scenes. I was working with the National Security Council. And Joe actually mentioned something that I thought was kind of interesting because he said, we should talk about testifying to Congress and how that wasn't enough. And, it's like, it was almost like, and I took this, I was like, oh, that hurts because it's not like we thought we were going to fix the problem. But testifying to Congress, and it took a lot of convincing to get the loft and the other folks to go there, was to open the door, to show that there can be a communication between two different groups that don't see eye to eye, and maybe never should see eye to eye, but have certain things that they're okay with together, and actually, work things out and understand each other and build sensitivities. So I really view that as, that's what CDC to me means. It's what the loft to me means. It's what I did in CFT at DARPA and everything else. It's just, I want to open the door. Everybody else can take it further because that's what I wish had happened to us back then. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Hope to see you at the signing, and it's good to be back.
Thanks, everybody.
If anyone's interested, I have a very limited number of 35th anniversary CDC challenge coins for sale, and if you want one, just pick me up.